You're looking for power in the wrong place, not because you're weak, not because you lack discipline, but because you were trained to ignore the moment power actually appears. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most people have felt real clarity before and walked right past it. Have you ever noticed that? There are moments when you don't overthink, you don't hesitate, you don't negotiate with yourself. You just know. No anxiety, no internal debate, no need to convince yourself. The decision feels clean, not exciting, not emotional, not dramatic, just clear. And later, sometimes much later, you look back and realize something unsettling. That moment was rare, and you didn't treat it as important. Now here's the question most people never ask. Why does that kind of clarity feel so uncommon? If it's actually part of who we are? Because if you slow down and really pay attention, a pattern starts to emerge. We spend most of our lives searching for power somewhere outside that state. In outcomes, in approval, in certainty, in control. We're taught very early that power lives out there, in the right decision, in the right timing, in the right validation. But almost no one teaches us how to recognize the moments when power is already online. Let me say that differently. There is a state of awareness where nothing inside you is arguing. No ego trying to prove something, no fear rehearsing the future, no role being maintained. That state doesn't shout, it doesn't push, it doesn't demand, it orients. Some people call it the higher self, others say elevated awareness, essence, intuition, true self. The name doesn't matter. What matters is this: when you're in that state, life moves with less friction and more truth. And almost everyone has touched it, even briefly. Think about it. Have you ever walked away from something without drama and only later realized it was one of the healthiest decisions you ever made? Have you ever said no without guilt and felt relief instead? Have you ever chosen a path that made no sense on paper, yet unfolded exactly as it needed to? Those moments weren't luck. They weren't bravery either. They were moments when you weren't looking for power. You were operating from it. Here's the paradox most people miss. We assume power should feel intense, loud, forceful, but this state feels almost quiet, which is why it's so easy to doubt. We've been trained to associate power with effort, force the decision, force confidence, force control. So when clarity arrives without force, we question it. We override it. We explain it away. We ask everyone else what they think. And slowly, without realizing it, we learn something dangerous. We learn to trust noise more than clarity. That conditioning starts early. We're rewarded for performance, not alignment, for explanation, not coherence, for certainty, not truth. So we build identities, strategies, mental armor. None of that is wrong, but the more complex the structure becomes, the harder it is to hear the signal underneath it. And instead of recognizing alignment when it appears, we start chasing what we think alignment should produce: success, recognition, stability, power. Which is why so many intelligent, capable people feel strangely disconnected from themselves. Even when life looks fine on the outside, they're searching for power in results, when power actually lives upstream, in orientation. And this is where most conversations get it wrong, because the real problem was never access. It was recognition. If you can't recognize this state while it's happening, you'll abandon it every time. And that's exactly what we need to look at next. Because once you understand how recognition works, power stops being something you chase and becomes something you return to. Stay with me. Let's get very precise now. If this state of clarity exists, and we've all touched it at some point, then the real mystery isn't how to reach it. It's why we so often leave it. Because if you replay those moments we mentioned, the clean decisions, the quiet certainty, you'll notice something important. They don't appear when life is under control. They appear when something drops. A role, an expectation, a performance. Sometimes it happens after exhaustion, sometimes after loss, sometimes after honesty we didn't plan. And suddenly there you are. Not smarter, not braver, just present. This is where people get confused. They think this state is something added to them. In reality, it shows up when something is removed. Noise is removed. Fear-based negotiation is removed. The need to impress, justify, or defend is removed. What remains isn't magical. It's coherent. And coherence feels very different from excitement. Excitement pulls you forward. Coherence aligns you. That's why this state doesn't feel dramatic. It feels obvious, almost boring, which is exactly why most people don't trust it. We've been trained to believe that important decisions should feel heavy, that power should feel charged, that truth should come with intensity. So when a decision feels simple, we second guess it. We ask, am I being careless? Am I avoiding something? Is this too easy to be right? But clarity doesn't argue. It doesn't need to. Here's another pattern worth noticing. When you're in this state, you don't feel the urge to convince anyone. You don't need permission. You don't need applause. You don't even need agreement. Not because you're closed, but because you're settled. Contrast that with moments driven by ego or fear. Those moments are noisy. They rehearse conversations. They imagine future reactions. They build arguments in advance. They're busy. Clarity is not busy. And this is where the title of this video really starts to make sense. We're taught to look for power in places that amplify noise. Control, certainty, dominance, external validation. None of those are power. They're compensations. Power, in the sense we're talking about, is not the ability to force outcomes. It's the ability to remain aligned even when outcomes are uncertain. That's a very different skill. And it's one that doesn't announce itself. Think about the last time you did something truly aligned. You probably didn't post about it. You didn't dramatize it. You didn't even fully explain it. You just did it. And afterward you felt intact. Not inflated, not superior. Intact. That feeling is a signal. It's how this state communicates. Not through emotion, but through integration. Nothing inside you is split. Now here's the uncomfortable part. If this state is quieter, simpler, and less performative, then living from it means letting go of certain identities. And that's where resistance appears. Because many of us have built our sense of self around effort, around being the one who tries harder, explains better, endures more. So when clarity suggests a cleaner path, one that requires less struggle, it can feel like a threat to who we think we are. This is why people often override their own intuition in favor of what looks responsible, strong, or logical. Not because intuition is weak, but because ego is loud, and ego has been mistaken for power for a very long time. Here's something subtle but crucial. This state doesn't remove difficulty from life. It removes friction with yourself. You may still face resistance externally. You may still make hard choices. But internally, there's no war. And when there's no internal war, energy stops leaking. That's why people in this state often seem grounded, even under pressure. Not because they know more, but because they're not divided. So the real shift isn't learning something new. It's learning to notice when division enters and when it disappears. Because the moment you recognize the absence of division, you're already closer to power than you think. In the final part, we're going to bring this down to ground level. How this plays out in everyday decisions. Why this state can't be forced, but can be recognized. And how power quietly reorganizes your life once you stop chasing it in the wrong place. We're almost there. So here is where everything truly comes together. If clarity is not something you force, and if power doesn't appear through effort, but through alignment, then the real work of life changes completely. It stops being about becoming more and starts being about returning. Because most of the time, we don't lose our direction all at once. We drift, and drifting almost always begins with very small moments of self-betrayal. You feel a clear inner signal and ignore it because it's inconvenient. You sense a boundary and cross it to avoid discomfort. You know the next step and delay it to keep things familiar, not because you're weak, not because you don't know better, but because conditioning is powerful. And every time that happens, something subtle but important occurs. You don't feel wrong, you feel misaligned, slightly disconnected, less centered, less whole. That sensation is not punishment. It's feedback. It's the body consciousness system signaling that you've moved away from your deeper alignment. That is the real cost of looking for power in the wrong place. Power is not destroyed in those moments. It's outsourced, given to urgency, to expectation, to the version of you that learned how to perform instead of align. This is why so many people live in constant effort. They're not lacking discipline, they're compensating for misalignment. Now here's what most people misunderstand about the higher self. It is not a voice that tells you what to do. It is not a mystical entity hovering above you. It is not something you channel or summon. The higher self is a state of coherence, a state where your mental field, emotional field, and energetic field are aligned in the same direction. In that state, intuition doesn't feel dramatic. It feels obvious. And because it feels obvious, people often dismiss it. They think, that can't be it. It's too simple. There must be more. But alignment is simple by nature. Not easy, simple. When you are aligned, you don't need to convince yourself. You don't need to rehearse explanations. You don't need external validation to move. Your actions feel internally authorized. That is power, not control over others, not domination over outcomes, but authorship. You are the author of your decisions again. And authorship changes everything. When you live from alignment, your choices become cleaner. Not perfect, cleaner. You stop negotiating against your own clarity. You stop outsourcing your authority to fear, urgency, or approval. And something very specific happens. Life doesn't become predictable. It becomes coherent. You may still face resistance. You may still experience loss. You may still make difficult decisions. But internally, there is no war. And when there is no internal war, energy stops leaking. That's why people who live from alignment often appear calm under pressure. Not because they know more, but because they are not divided. Now, let's be very honest. No one lives in this state permanently. Alignment is not a destination. It is a practice of return. The difference between people who live with direction and those who feel lost is not intelligence or discipline, it's recognition. The people who stay aligned recognize when they've drifted. And when they recognize it, they don't panic. They don't escalate effort. They don't shame themselves. They pause and they ask a different question. Not, how do I fix this? But, where did I stop listening? That question is powerful because it restores responsibility without blame. It doesn't attack the ego, it bypasses it. And from there, alignment becomes accessible again, not as a feeling, as a direction. This is where conscious will enters the picture. Alignment is not passive. It is not surrender without choice. It is conscious cooperation with your deeper intelligence. You still choose, you still act, you still decide, but now your will is aligned with your essence, not fighting against it. That is what makes decisions feel clean. That is what makes effort feel precise instead of exhausting. And once you experience that difference clearly, you cannot unlearn it. Because now you know what misalignment feels like. And you know what coherence feels like. And that awareness alone reorganizes your life. So here is the real conclusion of everything we've explored. Power was never outside you, but it was never something to be held, accumulated, or proven either. Power is something you return to, again and again and again. Each time you choose alignment over performance, each time you choose clarity over noise, each time you choose conscious direction over force. And that's when you realize something fundamental. Power was never something to be found, only something to be recognized. If this didn't move you emotionally, but recognitively, then you already know what this means for your life. Stay attentive, stay honest, and notice when alignment is present and when it's not. Because once you learn to recognize it, you stop abandoning yourself. If this helped you recognize something you couldn't quite name before, leave a comment, not explaining it, just acknowledging it. Subscribe, stay close, and keep walking with us. This is Human Wave, where awakened minds rise into a life of wholeness and fulfillment.